did, yes. Do you get a response from him?
George, you're okay with this? Okay with this?
Good afternoon and welcome back. I hope you feel well replenished after your lunch. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Professor George Bernard. Professor Bernard was originally going to pursue a different career path, that of a racing journalist, an interest he tells me that he has kept up throughout his life. So if you want a tip before the end of the day, then I suggest you speak to him after tea and coffee. But it was due to the influence of the parents of a couple in our congregation this afternoon that turned Professor Bernard's career path towards that of history, an inspirational history master at school, inspired a love of history in Professor Bernard. Professor Bernard is no stranger to Oxford. He won an open scholarship to St Catherine's College, and after a lectureship at Wolverhampton Polytechnic, became the Professor of Modern History at the University of Southampton, a post which he held until he recently retired during the pandemic. Professor Bernard has recently produced a book on the paradoxes of power in the Tudor Church, and is working now on rebuilding churches in the medieval period, which I gather is provisionally entitled The Rise of the Perpendicular.
The triumph.
The triumph of the perpendicular. This afternoon's lecture is entitled When Did England Become a Protestant Country? And straight out of the gate, the going is good, the turf is good. I hand over to Press Bernard.
Thank you. What I wish to probe is the view that in the course of the 16th century, a Protestant church and a Protestant nation emerged in England. Quote, starting out as a branch of the International Roman Catholic Church, it, that's to say the English Church, moved through a series of reformations to emerge under Elizabeth I as a unique, independent, national Protestant church. That's
Professor Bernard, if I may stop you, just so that we can pick you up on the live stream, if you could maybe go onto the upper step there, and then you'll be picked up by the camera. Thank you.
That the church moved through a series of reformations to emerge under Elizabeth I as a unique, independent series The church moved through a series of reformations to emerge under Elizabeth I as a unique I'm having difficulty in reading the text. Susan Doran and Chris Durston are the people who are writing here. That by 1603, not only a Protestant church, but also a Protestant nation had been created. For Eamon Duffy, Protestantism in late Elizabethan and Jacobean England can be judged by any criteria as a great success. Dermot MacCulloch judged that the Elizabethan church was a reformed church. A more cautious note was struck by MacCulloch's pupil Alec Ryrie when he referred to the transition from the Roman Catholic Church and it moved to the more or less Protestant church of the 1580s. In Mike Braddock suggested that with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that it was in the 1560s that the new Protestant identity of the church was settled, that in the 1560s, he thinks that the identity of the state was settled, but then he hedges his bets. Certainly quicker in the south of England, but certainly a Protestant country in the south. But the Church of England was for him Protestantized by 1603. And yet, he then goes on to say that it was by no means uniform in religion, that there are tensions here in insufficient precision. Sorry, I'm having difficulty focusing on my text, as you can probably tell. I'm not quite sure why, and that explains the rather halting presentation in this paragraph. But what I do there is to suggest that I'm quoting historians who claim that a Protestant church, a Protestant country have been established, but then they go on to almost undermine and subvert what they're saying because they talk about the more or less Protestant nation of the 1580s. Mike Braddock, the more or less, and Mike Braddock hedges his bets. Progress in certain areas was more rapid than in others. But certainly, he says, England was a Protestant country. But then he say that it was by no means uniform in religion by 1540. And I think Now, my claim in this talk is to say that it's a series, all this depends on how one defines Protestant. The tensions lie because historians haven't been precise enough in what they say. And what I'm going to argue is that the best way to sort this out is to ask a series of questions about what Protestant meant and test what was there against that criteria. If a Protestant country is one in which the authority of the Church, if a Protestant country is one in which the authority of the Pope is rejected and the Pope condemned as Antichrist, then at the official governmental level, the Church and the people, the country, became Protestant with Henry VIII's break with Rome in the early 1530s. Rapidly, emphatically, and repeatedly, Henry VIII made principal denunciations of the Pope and papal power, invoking a late 14th century statute of Praemunire, which restricted the authority of the foreign powers within the realm. And Henry VIII insisted on measures such as the compulsory swearing of oaths on every adult man, a procedure which is hard not to describe as tyrannical. And Henry secured obedience from his subjects, with only a few exceptions. Bishop Fisher, Thomas More, a number of observant monks, and for a time the Pilgrims of Grace accepted. In the late 1530s, this was complete. Henry declared and established his royal supremacy, and papal power within England was abolished. Henry's daughter Mary's reversion to papal obedience was short-lived and was repudiated at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign by the Act of Supremacy in 1559. Henry VIII's break with Rome has never since been reversed, and the lasting impact was profound, not least in continental perceptions of England. I am wondering whether I'm using the wrong pair of glasses. If you could bear with me, I will look for a
Do you read a lectern? What a lectern? Put the papers on.
that does anything.
Would a lectern help if there was
Sorry?
one? If there was a lectern to put your papers on, would that help?
A lectern
to put your papers on. I don't know whether there is one, but something to put your papers on.
I think this is what I should have been using. Let's see if it works. Let's see if it works, otherwise I'm getting a bit worried. If a Protestant country is one in which not just the monarch, but also the people rejected the papacy, that's something that we find from the later 16th century. Popular anti-popery was stimulated when the cause of the Pope became associated with the Spanish threat to English liberties in the 1580s, 1590s, which were interpreted in the light of the martyrologist John Fox's account of the burnings of Mary's reign. All this fostered a sense that England was a beleaguered isle threatened by Catholic religious obscurantism and political absolutism characterised by fiscal and social oppression, but also the conviction that the English were God's chosen people, put to the test but providentially spared. Intriguingly, Pat Collinson once wrote, "For Protestant nation, perhaps we should read anti-Catholic nation, a nation which celebrated with bonfire and bells its near miraculous deliverances from Armada and Gunpowder Plot, and which turned on its kings when they proved unreliable in withstanding popery." Such sentiments were further developed in the 17th century, notably in the perceptions of Louis XIV as a tyrannical and absolutist ruler, and there is plentiful evidence of recurring popular anti-popery in the 18th century. In her book, The Britons Forging the Nation, 1707-1783, Linda Colley makes great play of Protestantism as the defining feature of 18th century Britishness. But her case depends almost entirely on equating Protestantism with anti-popery. The resolution of the Constitutional Convention on the 29th of January 1689 that it has been found by experience to be inconsistent with the safety and welfare of this Protestant country to be governed by a popish prince, described by Tony Claydon and Ian McBride as an unequivocal and perhaps the first official recognition of the essential Protestantism of the nation. In effect, it defines Protestant as anti-papal. The question is, I think, that yes, in this sense the kingdom is Protestant, that this determined the political developments at the most vital level, deposition of James II, the business over the succession in 1714, the maintenance of prescriptions of Roman Catholics from office until 1832. Hannah Smith's intriguing recent presentation of the Hanoverian monks George I and George II as champions of Protestantism fits here, as does Tony Claydon and Stephen Conway's recent writings on English engagement with what they saw as a Protestant international. Not till the age of the French Revolution and the age of Napoleon did French popery cease to be a threat. Note that this is once again a definition of Protestant that relies heavily on the idea of an other, on popery as a negative, wicked thing against which Protestants stood united. It's not a very positive perspective. Hatred of our, that's to say the Catholic Church, is after all the only real foundation of the Church of England, a quote from Colin Hayden. Anti-Catholicism and xenophobia, as for the depth of this popular anti-popery, Hugh Trevor Roper, in private correspondence, was sceptical about the political sensitivity, the doctrinal subtlety of the anti-popery mobs, which were so easily and so unscrupulously mobilised in the 1640s, 1670s, 1680s. Anti-popery seems to me, Trevor Roper wrote, the English equivalent of the witch craze or the anti-Semitism of other countries, other times. I think I'd be more willing to allow some substance to this notion of popular anti-popery, but there remains Jeremy Gregory's pertinent question, is anti-popery enough to make a Protestant country? I think you can see that my early problems were the result of the wrong pair of glasses. I tried on a pair this morning, and obviously I put the wrong one in the wrong box. I do apologise. And to repeat, what I'm suggesting is that one needs to look at a range of definitions of Protestant and apply those to the country, to religious policies, to the attitudes of rulers. And what I have begun by doing is looking at anti-popery and suggesting that anti-popery is there at the royal level from Henry VIII, it's there in Elizabeth's reign, late Elizabeth's reign, and it's associated with secular matters like the Armada, and into the 17th century, Louis XIV as an autocratic ruler. But was it enough for a definition of a country to be Protestant because it's anti-Catholic? It's more telling question that given that matters were no longer quite so simple as a simple criterion of Protestantism might suggest. To define Protestantism as anti-popery masked all sorts of distinctions and divisions. There was soon a difference between those such as Richard Hooker, who set out the case for the Church of England in the 1590s. Hooker, while seeing the Pope as leading a church gravely in need of the kind of purifying reform that had been accomplished in England, Hooker nevertheless refused to see the Pope as Antichrist. And there's a big division between those who saw the Pope as Antichrist and those who wouldn't. Those who saw the Pope as the devil would regard any conflict, any contact, as inherently wicked. Queen Elizabeth undoubtedly saw the Pope as illegitimately claiming authority over her and over the Church of England, as well as a source of superstition. But missing from Elizabeth's remarks is any urgent, apocalyptic tone, any sense of the Pope as devilish. Much the same may be said about James I, who remarkably didn't react to the gunpowder plot by persecuting the Catholics. James refused to treat all Catholics as traitors, enthusiastically exploited any possibilities of ecumenical dialogue, of which the extraordinary career of De Dominis offers the most bizarre example. De Dominis, sometime Roman Catholic archbishop, welcomed in England on denouncing papal primacy, appointed Dean of Windsor, only to return to Rome, where he ended up dying in a papal prison. Charles I and Laud hoped to convince Catholics and that the Church of England was the true Catholic Church, and using that vocabulary. Whether the Pope was Antichrist was not just a theological question. Unavoidably, how it was answered affected England's relations with continental powers. To what extent was England part of a Protestant international from the later 16th century, part of a larger community of countries sharing the same religion and engaged in conflict to establish or maintain it? For over 40 years, from the early 1560s to the 1590s, France was racked by religious civil war between first Huguenots seeking the freedoms to worship in public and to organise their own churches, secondly, militant Catholics seeing the Huguenots as devilishly ensnaring the souls of the faithful, and thirdly, successive governments that struggled, sometimes to crush the Huguenots, sometimes to find some middle way, not only at the lowest common denominator of agreeing to differ and to tolerate, but more intriguingly in the hope of reuniting the Christians of France in a reformed Catholic Church. From the 1560s to the 1640s, with only a limited break between 1609 and 1621, the northern provinces of the Low Countries were fighting against the Spanish, not least to prevent the imposition of a Catholic Inquisition. From 1618, Germany was racked by religious wars, which at first Catholics made major advances, but they were then later compelled to compromise. The question and challenge facing the English and English rulers was what the English could and should do. Charles Wilson movingly criticised Elizabeth for not helping the Huguenots and Calvinists of France and the Low Countries, but preparing conciliation and marriage alliances with Catholic monarchs, princes, princesses. James I was deeply ambivalent, sponsoring marriage alliances with Protestant powers, but shying away from military support, dreaming dreams of a reunification of Christendom, not much different from the French governments at various times. Charles I was prepared to confront the Catholic powers of France and Spain in the 1520s, but rather less so in the 1630s, and he married Henrietta Maria, French princess, who was allowed to worship the Catholic. My point in this is to say that it tempers any easy characterisation of England or English monarchs as clearly and committedly Protestant, in the sense of anti-popery, maybe in parts, but not in any way fully. And this picture is reinforced by looking at different aspects of relationships and the question of trade. Pauline Croft has written intriguingly how Englishmen and Spanish alike cared more for their livelihoods than they did for any consideration of foreign policy. Committed and aggressive Protestant sentiment is not to be found in merchant literature. In assessing Elizabethan public opinion, it's vital not to swallow wholesale, Pauline Croft writes, either the splendid rhetoric of the Tilbury speech, composed for a moment of national crisis, or the polemics of clerical dons penning hot Protestant tracts from the safety of their Cambridge colleges. And if the English first acquiesced in the repudiation of papal authority, and if later anti-popery became a popular rallying cry, nevertheless popery was never totally eliminated. Numbers of Catholics may have been small and riven by disagreements, but nevertheless the majority of gentry remained Catholic, more or less tolerated in practice by their neighbours, supporting priests who celebrated secret masses. And Catholic commoners are being found by historians too. What surprises is not that successive governments fined Catholics for not going to church and imposed oaths on Catholics, but on how limited and inconsistent such efforts were. And any quick labelling of even 18th century England as Protestant must take on board the debates and the controversies stretching over decades that ultimately led to Catholic emancipation in 1832. So yes, England and English monarchs are anti-Catholic in the ways that I've been suggesting, but there are all sorts of aspects which I think qualify, maybe subvert the picture of a clearly Protestant country or church. If a Protestant country is one in which monasteries have been abolished, in which groups of women and men no longer set their face from the world, but devote themselves to no longer set their face from the world, but devote themselves to an endless round of prayer. Again, how far that would have been an accurate view of the late medieval church. But in the 1530s, the monasteries were dissolved, and the result of the dissolution of monasteries, is that enough to make a country a Protestant country? Was the dissolution of monasteries society in which groups of men and women no longer set their face from the world and devote themselves to a round of prayer? Is this enough to make England a Protestant country? I do think that the dissolution of monasteries can be seen as a revolution, and I think that the dissolution of monasteries profoundly affected the character of English religion, not least that it meant that England was not much influenced by the piety and the practices of the Counter-Reformation religious orders, notably the Jesuits, which have had such a profound impact in continental Europe, not least in how poverty is relieved. So the dissolution of the monasteries, I do think, makes a big difference, but whether it actually makes England a Protestant country, whether it's sufficient for that, I'm not so sure. If a Protestant country is one in which men and women don't go to pilgrimage on shrines associated with the relics of saints, then the dismantling of the pilgrimage shrines in the late 1530s on royal orders, because they were centres of superstition, whether this was perhaps the most significant step. As events unfolded, the abolition of pilgrimages, the dismantling of shrines, may well have led people away from traditional religion and towards Protestantism. But while that may have been the long-run consequences, that the lack of monasteries affects the character of a religion, of a church, I think it takes a long time for this to work through. And I think that the impetus behind the dissolution of monasteries and the destruction of monasteries was in the end not Protestant, but Erasmian. I think it's the teaching of the scholar Desiderius Erasmus that not all was well with the church, and in particular certain practices, such as those associated with pilgrimage to the shrines of saints. This came close, in Erasmus's view, to superstition. And I think it's this that prompts the dissolution of the monasteries. I'm sceptical whether the monasteries were dissolved by Henry VIII for money. I think the main purpose was political, the sense that the monasteries could be a fifth column, and that there was a profound difference between what Henry thought and what traditionally monks thought of what they were doing. And the attacks on pilgrimages only went so far. Parish churches in England remained dedicated to saints. Pilgrimage of a kind, perhaps involving holy wells and holy places in the landscape, survived in attenuated form. I don't think that can meaningfully be seen as a Protestant sensibility. Alex Walsham claims that this is a particular style of Protestantism. I don't agree. I think it's an example of the incomplete and the ambivalent English Reformation, which is, I suppose, the theme at the heart of my paper this afternoon. If a Protestant country is one in which the Bible is available in English, then Henry VIII's reign from the late 1530s marks a crucial point. Translations of the Bible were often Protestant. Translations were often Protestant from the 1530s in the rendering of key words or passages. Notes in the margins, prefaces could reinforce a Protestant theological message. Yet it might be unwise to suppose that the preaching of the Bible in the vernacular necessarily made readers Protestant. Catholic reformers, indeed Henry VIII himself, were not opposed in principle to translation. But they were cautious about tendentious translations, tendentious readings. And it would take a generation or more after the 1530s before the Bible really could be expected to make a general impact. Nor would the Bible ever be the only reading available. Chivalric romances, classical mythologies, histories of kings and queens would compete, and values would clash and intermesh. Ian Green has been making an important and powerful case based on intensive scrutiny of books used in education and power and at different levels, and of inscriptions and epitaphs used in funerary monuments in churches. And Ian has been suggesting that the influence of the classics and classical values was profound, so much so that in the 18th century classical and Christian values were seen as interchangeable, certainly not as antipathetic. If a Protestant country is one in which masses and prayers are no longer offered for the souls of the departed, then it's the dissolution of the chantries in the reign of Edward VI, which is the crucial event. Clearly a world in which people could no longer pray for the souls of the departed, commission masses for the purpose, because this was no longer thought to be necessary or useful. Clearly this is different from the world that had gone before. Yet matters were not as clear-cut as that might at first seem. For some Elizabethan theologians, prayers for the dead should be condemned, but there were others, and particularly parish priests, who in attenuated form practiced just that. Eamon Duffy has pointed out that funerals brought out the residual Catholic beliefs, and continuing belief in ghosts hints at the continued assumption of some sort of purgatory. If a Protestant country is one in which all sorts of images, statues, paintings, runes, once removed from parish churches as idolatrous, which have been removed, then the reign of Edward VI is significant. All images, the statues, the wooden carvings, the paintings, stained glass, were to be removed from parish churches in Edward's reign. And as far as the sources permit, that does seem to have happened, though some of these things were stored and kept for a better day rather than being destroyed. In Elizabeth's reign, the first year saw destruction of runes and images, and there was much destruction in the Civil War of the 1640s. But at the same time, there were still works of craftsmanship, like a board in Ludlow Parish Church, which included the monogram of Christ's name and the lily of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Churches, more subversively, in themselves could be seen as agents of architectural seduction, in Dermot McCullough's vivid phrase. Religious imagery endured, indeed developed, in later 16th century funerary monuments in churches, as I've been suggesting. So there were, as it were, again, dimensions of this that, yes, iconoclasm was state-sponsored for a time, but from the 1590s particularly, painted glass, classical monuments, communion plate, pulpits, all these perhaps suggest some sort of aesthetic impulse, and they're found within the Church of England. I think this is not a militantly anti-religious imagery policies over time. If a Protestant country is one in which the ecclesiastical structure is modelled on the Protestant church established by Luther, and it was the Lutheran princes who at the Diet of Speyer in 1529 issued a Protestatio, a declaration against the failure of the Diet, the representative assembly, to endorse the reforms in 1529 which they sought, and that led to the use of the word Protestant to describe them. If it was if we're looking at Calvinist church organisation, crucially, no complex ecclesiastical courts and canon law, then by that standard, England was not a Protestant country. Parish church clergy were not chosen by congregations, but much as before, they were preferred to their benefices by a variety of patrons, as well as lay, as well as ecclesiastical, and answerable to diocesan bishops. Intriguingly, the Edwardian reformers in Edward VI's reign never attempted to abolish episcopacy. Indeed, some Elizabethan and Stuart churchmen and divines came to develop a very high sense of the divinely instituted role of bishops. The models of English prelates of the later 16th century, their models were pre-Reformation bishops, not the reformed clergy of continental Europe, not superintendents. And the evidence of episcopal tombs is striking in this respect. It is interesting how James I was committed to bishops, a system of government he greatly preferred to that of the Scottish Calvinists. From the 1570s, there were recurring campaigns to introduce a Presbyterian system in which ministers were equals without hierarchical superiors, superintendents apart. But no such system was ever introduced in England. Only in the interregnum and the Protectorate was there some measure of giving congregations independence, freedom from episcopal control, central control. But of course that was also short-lived. The survival of ecclesiastical courts following canon law, not much change from the pre-Reformation period, reinforces the picture. So does the remarkable prominence within the Church of England of the cathedrals, whose only obvious function was the celebration of the liturgy, and they did not become centres of Protestant evangelism. The very continuation of the cathedrals, visible, expensive, meant that the continuation of forms of worship which emphasised the liturgy, the role of the clergy in performing the liturgy, the place of music. And Elizabeth, I think, is crucial in this, that she, early in her reign, issued proclamations that the clergy, that the cathedrals, in particular the musical aspects, the choral aspects of cathedrals, should be preserved. For those looking from other countries and those in which a Protestant Presbyterian system had been established, the Church of England would have appeared, and indeed perhaps still does appear, not to be Protestant. Intriguingly, when reporting ecumenical plans in Scotland between the Church of Scotland, the Scottish Episcopal Church, the Methodist United Reformer Church in 2010, the Scotsman noted that there are strong arguments which suggest that the Episcopal Church, a member of the Anglican Communion, is not a Protestant church at all. I might come back to that. If a Protestant country is one in which the authority of royal power has been limited, then the monarchical Church of England, and dominated, I would argue, by the initially similar preferences in England of Henry VIII, Elizabeth, James I and Charles I, was not Protestant. A Protestant church was one in which the monarch wielded considerable authority over the church. A monarchical church was one in which the attitudes of at times of religious division, the attitudes of the monarch would have a crucial, indeed a decisive say. In the monarchical church, the convictions of the monarch were thus crucial. Henry VIII asserted his royal supremacy over the church, as I've shown. Henry VIII, in belief and practice, was no Protestant, but he brutally and skillfully imposed outward conformity on his remade church. That the church remained a monarchical church in Elizabeth's reign was vividly shown in Elizabeth's suspension of Archbishop Grindal over prophesyings, a most striking illustration of royal control over the church. Grindal wanted to hold meetings of groups of clergy to discuss the Bible and theological topics. Elizabeth told him not to. He refused. She suspended him from exercising his office. All bishops continued to be appointed by the Crown. The Book of Common Prayer put prayers for the monarch in the place of prayers to saints. Coats of arms got pride of place over statues and where there would have been pictures of saints. And by this time, Europe was divided over religion. Elizabeth's response was crucial. There was much debate about the nature of the religious change made at the beginning of her reign. My guess is that Elizabeth had gone further than she really wanted in 1558-9. She faced considerable opposition from Catholics, including Mary's bishops. She wanted to show clearly that, like her father, she was rejecting the authority of the Pope and what went with it. But because Catholics, especially the bishops and Catholic noblemen, would not support her, she was forced to rely on councillors, probably more Protestant than she was. Even so, the religious settlement was deeply ambiguous. And what's remarkable is that Elizabeth would not go beyond what was agreed in 1558, 1560. She was a Protestant if measured by the exclusion of the Pope as Anne Boleyn's daughter, that's perhaps not surprising, and by excluding open Catholics from court and Privy Council. But she wasn't, I think, liturgically or doctrinally a Protestant. And she simply resisted any further reformation. And this has led to some rather awkward characterisations by scholars who were really rather wanting to recruit Elizabeth to their side. Christopher Marsh's description of Elizabeth's deeply conservative form of Protestantism, or his remark that Elizabeth I was not one to force the Protestant pace, or to show him, I think shows these scholars as straining to keep Elizabeth within the Protestant fold. Lucy Wooding presents an unequivocally, if predominantly Protestant queen, which I agree more with Felicity Heal. Much of Elizabeth's later behaviour towards her church was so idiosyncratic and ambiguous that it was hard to see it driven by the pure light of the gospel. Elizabeth wrote many private prayers, perhaps 100 surviving letters dealing with religion, they show, Susan Doran argues, that what she wanted was her quiet and compliance, that she was fearful that preaching would lead to dissension on controversial matters. It's hard to think that anyone who wanted further reform would have been disillusioned by. I mean, it's hard not to think that anyone who wanted further reform would have been disillusioned. Of course, Elizabeth wouldn't have seen it like that. She thought that the church, the monarchical church, was hers to rule over, and her preferences had a considerable impact. By leaving the doctrine and liturgy of the church as ambiguous, by leaving it open to varied interpretations, she was in effect giving her subjects a significant measure of freedom. A variety of practices were in effect tolerated. I don't think these reflected weakness or fears that her Catholic subjects might plot and rebel against her. And I'm not doubting that Elizabeth could be fierce against Jesuit missionary priests, but I think she did believe in a broad-based church. It was not for monarchs to make windows in men's souls, as long as they conformed openly and refrained from taking action against her. Get involved with the Jesuit missionary priest, trying to hold meetings of clergy, that was not acceptable. If James I was more Protestant in belief, if he found the Church of England with its bishops more palatable than the Presbyterian church he grew up with, if he dreamed ironical dreams of a reunited Christendom, that is interesting. What kind of a Protestant is he there? Charles I's religious convictions are controversial, but I would argue that he's not all that far from the beliefs and practices of Henry VIII, Elizabeth and James, as is so often claimed. And these rulers held deep religious convictions, were conscious of their duty to God, but religious policy is, I think, not to be thought of in Machiavellian terms, but more that they adopted religious policies which they believed in, which they thought had social material benefits, and because they believed the teachings of the church. So I think that their policies were more similar than it's fashionable to allow, especially the wish for conformity, uniformity and order. And these practices mattered, as Patrick Collinson ruefully noted when lamenting the failure of the state church to define and to underwrite Protestant orthodoxy. Royal supremacy and monarchical interests frustrated more than that they helped the cause of Reformation. That was because the monarchs were not committed to Patrick Collinson's sort of Protestant Reformation. If a Protestant country is one in which the doctrine, the official doctrine of the Church, is Protestant, then Henry VIII's refusal to accept the Lutheran Confession of Augsburg has proved the most lasting influence on the Church of England. Ever since that time, the 1530s, the true character of that official doctrine has been a matter of sharp and constant debates. Churchmen and historians of all persuasions have boldly proclaimed that the beliefs of the Church were and are that beliefs Churchmen and historians have claimed that what they are arguing as the beliefs of the Church of England would be open to dispute, and that in a sense what they are doing is making a claim rather than making a description. The second Edwardian prayer book of 1552 has the best claim to be seen as Protestant, fully Protestant. But the 1552 prayer book did not remain for long, I would argue. If it had, and Edward VI had grown up as a Protestant ruler, then this talk would have been very different. But he didn't. The Elizabethan religious settlement, and especially of 39 articles, was much more ambiguous, open to opposed interpretations. Catholicism rejected, but in other places, Catholic teachings on salvation, not least, re-enter indirectly. Lutheran doctrines, justification by faith alone, Calvinist doctrines, predestination, have been an unending source of dispute. Nicholas Tyek has claimed that the 1552 prayer book was revived in Elizabeth's reign. I think that that's very questionable. E.J. Bicknell's reading the 39 articles, still among the shrewdest, includes telling details that could not be endorsed by Calvinists. I think the Church of England, in these respects, is best to be seen as of its own kind, as sui generis. By comparison, the church reformations that took place in Switzerland and Germany in the 1520s, the Reformation in Scotland in 1560, were much more consistent in doctrine. That followers of Calvin pressed repeatedly for further domination of the Elizabethan Church of England suggests that by this test, the Church of England was never doctrinally Protestant. Felicity Heald's comparison of the English Articles and the Scots Confession highlights the differences. The Scots emphasised God's eternal law and immutable decree. The darkness of men's mind, the unmerited grace of the Creator, and denounce as sinners who were though excluded from salvation. On the other hand, the English Articles present election as a sweet, pleasant, unspeakable comfort, while remaining silent on the invisible church of the elect. I'm quoting from Felicity Heald. Modern historians who've argued that in Elizabethan and Jacobean England there was a Calvinist consensus have in practice grounded their claims on theological studies in universities, hardly a sound way of characterising the church as a whole. But even here, Calvinist theology didn't reign supreme, as Harry Porter memorably pointed out. And of course, the so-called Arminians, who would question Calvinist teaching on predestination, emerged from the same universities as the Calvinists. If a Protestant country is one in which the liturgy of the church, the forms of church services, modelled on those of Luther or Zwingli or Calvin, then what happened in England at once led to heated disputes which remain today. In Henry VIII's reign, the Latin Mass was retained, but the celebration of Saints' Days was severely limited. Clearly, the Edwardian prayer book, both the 1549 one, the radical, but nevertheless, the 1549 one, Stephen Gardiner, bishop, was able to argue that he could live with it. I think he was making debating points, but they could be made. Much harder to do that with 1552, as I've been suggesting. That prayer book seems to me to be unequivocally Protestant. But, as I've already said, Edward VI did not live long. Its influence is more limited. And then in the reign of Elizabeth, the religious settlement at the beginning of the reign, I think, was fundamentally ambiguous. Right from the start, open to interpretation and exploitation. The divisions, the tensions between what would later be described as low and high church forms of worship were, in my view, embryonically present already in the later years of Henry VIII's reign, as much as Elizabeth's reign. I don't think that the High Church was an alien imposition on the Church of England, because the Church of England had never become a clearly Protestant country and church in that sense. And then there were patterns of church services which owe perhaps more to the pre-Reformation past, especially with stress on ceremony and ritual aspects, music, I've already mentioned, cathedrals and so on, that it's all very well to talk about tiptoeing away from a Calvin and the reformed world of the 17th century, but that assumes that the English church was a Calvinist church, and I beg to differ from Dermot McCulloch there. And the debates over altars, they were supposed to be replaced by a communion table, but as anyone who has tried lifting the communion tables in Oxford chapel, college chapels, will know how much of a strain that would place on the back. And what is pretty clear, not least from a survey that Burley carried out in 1565, is that the communion table was placed in every which way. There was no conformity, there was no order. Charles I would try to impose order on altars, and some scholars would argue that that was extremely unpopular, but the sources would suggest that policy was obeyed. It doesn't mean to say that policy was popular, but maybe the opposition to it has been exaggerated. And maybe the answer there would lie in Christopher Wren's churches, in which the altar stands at an east end which is not prominent, that it's possible to sit quite close to the altar, to the area of the church which has been railed in. This isn't a medieval altar, but it isn't a Protestant communion table either. If a Protestant country is one in which the ruling classes were Protestant, then England was far from being Protestant. The administrators who ruled England had a very varied collection of religious preferences. There were undoubtedly many godly gentry and godly urban magistrates, especially in the second half of Elizabeth's reign. But ultimately, they tended more to get in disputes than to succeed in imposing. Most conformed. The English civil wars of 1640, though, would reveal how divided the nobility and the gentry were over religion, since it was the result, as well as the reflection, of profound divisions within the English classes. That should give us pause. If the divisions over which the Civil War was fought was largely religion, if these were England's wars of religion, as John Morrell put it, if these were wars between Protestants, if the Civil War was a kind of violent referendum between what sort of Protestant nation England was and ought to be, what does that make of any common Protestantism? The forceful opposition of the Marian bishops to the Elizabethan religious settlement ensured that there would be no bishops taken on from the previous regime, one possible exception. But in practice, there was a great deal of variety among the bishops if you try to trace their political, religious sympathies, just their shades. Where in this spectrum, asked Penman Williams, can the true church be found? Was there any real consensus? Some Elizabethan bishops did try to build up a godly commonwealth. Ros Oates has shown that that's what Toby Matthew was doing, her hero. But whatever his aspirations, he conformed to the monarchical Church of England at its most oppressive and frustrating. And I would be willing to allow that it wasn't careerism alone which meant that he held his peace when Grindal was suspended. But the fact is that that suggests that his role was rather more limited than he would maybe have wanted to. The bulk of the population, they weren't Protestant. There were people, ordinary people, who opposed religious change. The rebellions in the 16th century over religion were against religious change, not in favour of it. There weren't any rebellions in favour of a Calvinist Reformation. I'm not persuaded by some attempts to see the 1549 rebellions in that way. The support for Mary in 1553 seems to reflect religious convictions, that there were still many people who would prefer to be Catholic, and they saw Mary as their leader. And as Ralph Holbrook had shown, lay officials were much involved in the persecution in Mary's reign, that this was still not a church which was Protestant through and through. There had been some artisans and traders in Henry-C in England who it would be fair to call Zwinglian or Lutheran, but they were not anywhere near a majority. There were certainly people who got together and discussed the Bible against Elizabeth's wishes, and there were groups of Calvinists who would meet Puritans, discuss the Bible, give their children biblical names. But there's a missionary quality about such activity. It rather shows that the bulk of the population was not with them. It was possible for illiterate women and men to absorb the teachings of Protestantism, and by the time of the Civil War, the 1640s and 1650s, they were influential, but they were still not a majority. The civil wars were fought because the political nation split down the middle. One half favoured religious change, the other manifestly didn't. This isn't a united country. The English church was attacked not least because of its the liturgy and its ceremonies by those who were critical, militant Calvinists. That makes, I think, some sense. More common, though, of ordinary people was what scholars have called parish Anglicanism, or rustic Pelagianism, a kind of basic belief in good works and a merciful God who would welcome people coming back before they died. But again, what I would stress is in the late 16th and in the 17th century, the sheer variety of religious beliefs on doctrine, on liturgy. I haven't mentioned, I think I must have skipped over a page, but with the question of doctrine, what I would emphasise there is the ambiguity of Elizabeth's religious settlement, and that it seems to me that the combining of the prayer books of 1562 and 1552, the 1560 and 15, was almost deliberate ambiguity. Read the sentences on the Eucharist and you, I think, can interpret them both in terms of traditional Catholic teachings and, in a sense, of Protestant teachings. There's an ambiguity there, fundamentally. And I suspect that Elizabeth may well have had something to do with it. If you're a ruler and you are trying to persuade your subjects of particular features, maybe having them included, even if perhaps almost contradictorily in a set of beliefs, it gives them a certain official status, it gives them something that those who find them sympathetic can point to. And I think Elizabeth, in this respect, was, I think, Henry VIII's daughter. Henry, many of his religious codifications are profoundly ambiguous, contradictory, but I don't think it's because he's stupid or his advisor's stupid, but this was as good as Henry could get without upsetting too many people. And it was something you could then build on. The next settlement would be more to your liking, more what you want. If the Protestant country is one in which the people live upright, God-fearing lives, well then England wasn't a Protestant country. But perhaps nowhere was by those criteria. Perhaps that's the problem. And in England, there does seem to me to have been a remarkable preference for well, I don't know what to call it, a belief in cakes and ale, a lack of sympathy for Puritans and moralists. It is interesting how Shakespeare and Johnson take Puritans to task. The cakes and ale, there are official pronouncements in James's reign and Charles's reign in favour of the playing of sports. This is a style of communal life which is interesting, but I think it's hard to call it Protestant in any way that compares with the Calvinist consistory courts in which morals are probed and upheld. And it's because of this that the scholar Graham Murdoch could write that the institutional regulation of community discipline, the essential mark of a true church, that you don't find in Elizabeth's reign. My final question, if a Protestant country is one in which the clergy, of which are pastors of which Luther or Calvin could be proud, then England was never part of that. As I've already said, clergy were appointed, many of them by lay people, and subject to all sorts of pressures and so on. And the existence of, say, in the universities, some scholars who embraced Lutheran or Zwinglian doctrines isn't, I think, enough to make a Protestant country. And in terms of the clergy, what is needed is not some kind of transformation in their role and their duties, but simply the constant recurring matter of, as it were, weeding, of constantly reforming. The church was semper reformanda, always in need of reforming, Christianising. It's a weeding, it's a continuing project, not something that is ever finally achieved. Finally, some larger comparisons would be useful. It's implausible that in the later 16th and early 17th century, England would be described as a Protestant country in the same senses as it would be plausible looking back to describe late medieval England as a Catholic country. In the late 16th century, Spain could be described as a Catholic country, or Sweden a Lutheran country. But I don't think that England would pass muster in that way. I'm aware that I'm risking comparing the ambiguities and limitations of the English experience against an ideal type of a Protestant church or Protestant society that was never recognised. And certainly there were all sorts of developments, tensions, creative or destructive, within Calvinism, not least in the richness of biblical and theological studies. Protestant countries weren't theocracies, and secular influences were considerable. All organised churches have liturgies and the worship of patterns of worship and an aesthetic. But these liturgies are very different from what you get in England. Gerald Strauss claimed that the German Reformation failed because it didn't educate enough young Germans. But nevertheless, he sees the enterprise as coherent and supported by political authority. For all the tensions and ambiguities, if you set a similar checklist of questions to those that I've been proposing, applying it to Lutheran Germany and Lutheran Scandinavia, Calvinist Switzerland, Calvinist Scotland, Low Countries, I think that there would be a lot more ticks than there would be doing it to England. Describing the Church of England and the Scottish Kirk as Protestant is reasonable if anti-popery is the test, but it distorts if it's taken much further. And if the Church of England was a Protestant church, why did the Scots press so vigorously for fundamental reform during the Civil War? And why did the Scots insist on a separate national church after the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1704? The point of such comparisons is to make the point that defining Protestant as Puritan or as godly, while others present as Protestant what Puritans would have thought of as lax. It's not that I'm looking at, as it were, weighing the odds, and it's rather that the condition of England was remarkable and of its own kind, sui generis. I'm not, as it were, playing games with a definition of Protestant which varies. On the contrary. And I think it's what two English monarchs, Henry VIII and Elizabeth, did and did not do, what they wanted and what they didn't want. That, I think, is the key to understanding the later 16th and early 17th century court. That if you call the Church of England Protestant, you're making a partisan point. You're saying what some of its inhabitants thought it should have been, or what it should have not have been, rather than describing it as it was. These confusions are neatly reflected in the juxtaposition of successive sentences in a recent textbook. The confident assertion that the Elizabethan religious settlement was in reality uncompromisingly Protestant, and then those Protestants, those historians who've in the past described it as a via media between Protestantism and Catholicism, have obscured its true nature, and the brief acceptance that Protestantism created a hybrid church in England that was unique to Europe. The most fruitful way forward is to recognise the uniqueness, but not to glorify it. Thank you. Sorry to have taken longer.
Thank you, Professor Bernard, for persevering through the vicissitudes of optometry to show us the complexity of answering this question of when England became a Protestant country, the complexity of defining what it means to be Protestant, and in terms of political life, religious life, doctrine, but also how far that pervades the life of the country, from the rulers, the nobility to the general populace. So thank you for that, and making a case that it's hard to classify the Church of England according to other churches that might be called Protestant. I think now would be a good time to break for tea before said evening prayer back in here at 3:30. And as well as racing tips, if you want to ask Professor Bernard any questions, then do collar him over tea or after evening prayer. Are you saying for evening prayer?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. But best to try and collar Professor Bernard over coffee any questions that you may have. But thank you again. Should we, Professor Bernard?